That way we can have the session as afterwards. Almost everybody is joined. I just want to welcome everybody to this second day of the series. Today we're going to focus on the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And as everybody knows, we'll be continuing throughout the week, and we'll have our moderators, Professor Rangita de Silva Alvis and Dr. Paloma Duran La Laguna, for guiding us through today's session. So once again, please feel free to share your questions in the chat, and we'll be attentive through them. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Pelayo. Welcome to our young leaders from around the world who are joining us on this second day to address the most challenging issue of our time, building back better using the gender equality principles in the International Women's Human Rights Framework. And today we build on yesterday's conversation on the Beijing Platform of Action. We discussed last afternoon the ways in which the Beijing Platform of Action had helped to inform, develop, and shape new laws around the world, new forms of activism, new forms of social movement building, and new forms of groundbreaking litigation efforts. Today's discussion on the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women looks at the CEDAW's core values. The CEDAW is the Global Bill of Rights for Women. It is universal, inalienable, and non-derogable. All countries of the 197 countries have joined the CEDAW except for 6, including the United States, Sudan, Iran, Somalia, Tonga, and Palau. So the United States, my own country, is among countries such as Sudan, Iran, and Somalia to yet ratify this important convention. So today's conversation that Paloma and I will be conducting with our eminent guest, Indira Jaisingh, we'll look at first on how the core values, the core principles of the convention have been translated into practice nationally and domestically. The most important element of this convention is how can it be transformed into practice through lawmaking, litigation, and reporting and organizing. And there is no one more preeminent than Indira Jaisingh, the first woman in India to be designated a senior advocate by the High Court of India, to join us to speak about her path-breaking career as a women's human rights lawyer, practitioner, and scholar. I often refer to Indira Jaisingh as the Ruth Bader Ginsburg of South Asia, because just like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she went through the entire landscape of India's laws and identified the laws that subordinated women, that devalued women, and one by one she challenged them in the courts of India. So her entire career spans this development in the law in India towards a feminist jurisprudence. So given the fact that we have so little time with this eminent human rights practitioner, I want Indira to address one particularly critical aspect of the Indian law, India's personal laws or family laws that disallowed women equality under the law, both under Hindu law, the Islamic law, the Muslim law, and the Christian law. And in order to dismantle these discriminatory laws in India, she represented 3 important feminist activists, as petitioners to dismantle and to change the law in India. So she represented Mary Roy, a Syrian Christian woman who fought for equal inheritance rights. She represented Geeta Hariharan and Vandana Shiva, who fought for equality in the guardianship of their children. Then she also fought on behalf of Daniel Latifi, who fought for equal rights in divorce under the Muslim law. And because of Indira's activism as a practitioner, not only did these individuals get recourse and relief, but because of these cases, these groundbreaking public interest litigation actions, Indira helped to inform and revise the law in India. So Indira, I want you to start by telling us a little bit about your work as a women's human rights practitioner in India and how you represented these three women under the three personal laws in India.
Thank you, Rangita, for inviting me to say a few words. Yes, it's my pleasure. You're right in saying that throughout my career, I have identified laws which discriminate against women and challenge them, indeed, in the Supreme Court of India, which is the highest court of the land. We have a provision in our constitution which enables us to leapfrog all the courts and go directly to the Supreme Court if it is a matter of great public interest. And it is Article 32 of the Constitution. So it is under this article that these petitions came to be filed. Let me tell you about them one by one. And I must say that there was a strategy behind taking these up one at a time. First of all, you need to know that India recognizes what we call quote unquote personal laws, which means laws which govern the religion to which you belong. So India recognizes Muslim law for Muslims, Hindu law for Hindus, Christian laws for Christians, Parsi laws for Parsis. And so each of the women of these communities are governed by separate laws. And so out of necessity, you have to challenge each one of these laws separately. So the first really important challenge which came before the Supreme Court was a law governing Syrian Christian women. This community is a very wealthy community. They own tea estates and coffee estates in South India. And the law actually said in black and white that the daughter of the family will get a maximum of 5,000 rupees, which would be the equivalent of, let's say, $50. And the rest of the estate would go to the son. It was such a scandalous law, which was more than a century old, that it was just waiting to be challenged. But what you need to know is that Mary Roy herself was an extremely feisty woman. She had two children. One of her children, Arundhati Roy, is a well-known, renowned author worldwide, and another son. And she had founded a school for children on her own. But she said to me that I could not tolerate this law. It was also about her financial sustainability, because she was in a bad domestic relationship. She had been thrown out of the shared household by her own husband. She went back to her parental home. And when she went back to her parental home, she found she was unwelcome. That's when she decided to challenge this law. So Rangita's right in saying that some of these women that I represented were extraordinary women. And I have always said that I am the lawyer I am because of the women I've represented. They've made me the lawyer that I am. I drew strength from them and they drew strength from me. So
So
these are,
it was a real feminist methodology that you brought to your work. So can you tell us, tell me and Dr. Duran, the ways in which you mobilize the CEDAW as an important tool? Because I know that whenever there was a lacuna in the Indian law, you used the CEDAW to fill in the gaps. And I think that is the most powerful aspect of the CEDAW, the ways in which it can be translated locally and domestically.
Yes. So let me tell you first of all that India is a dualist country. International law doesn't automatically apply to India. Just because we sign a treaty, it does not mean that international conventions become the law of the land. India needs to pass domestic legislation on these laws. Now, we know that we do not have domestic legislation on all aspects of CEDAW, and so it becomes very important for us to find a strategy to apply CEDAW to India. Now, the seminal case on the subject was the Vishaka judgment, and this judgment quite simply says that if there is a gap in municipal law, and if there is nothing contrary in municipal law to international law, then the courts will apply international law directly in India. And this judgment concerned sexual harassment at the workplace. At that point of time, we had no law in India which referred to sexual harassment. So the court turned to CEDAW, the court turned to civil and political rights, the court turned to social and political rights in international law, and they said, we will directly domesticate international law into national law. And we will say that sexual harassment at the workplace is a form of violation of the right to work, because CEDAW deals with the removal of all forms of discrimination against women, and sexual harassment is a form of discrimination against women. Rangita, in similar manner, the court rendered an opinion in the Geeta Hariharan case, where the domestic law said that the father is the natural guardian of the child. Now, we challenged this law on the ground that India had signed CEDAW, and that this kind of law cannot be allowed to continue. So here's what the court said, quote unquote, the message of international instruments, the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, 1979, CEDAW, and the Beijing Declaration, which directs all state parties to take appropriate measures to prevent discrimination of all forms against women, is clear. India is a signatory to CEDAW, having accepted and ratified it in June 1993. The interpretation that we have placed on Section 6 of the Hindu Guardianship and Minority Act gives effect to the principles contained in these instruments. The domestic courts are under an obligation, note the word obligation, to give due regard to international conventions and norms for constructing domestic laws, construing domestic laws when there is no inconsistency between them. This sums up.
I wanted to pause there because this is so important as a way of understanding the methodology of translating the CEDAW into domestic and national practice. And as you said, Geeta Hariharan was one of the seminal cases that you argued where the Supreme Court used both the CEDAW and the Beijing Declaration as persuasive authority for their ruling. And yesterday we spoke about the importance of the Beijing Declaration as one of the seminal documents on women's empowerment, and now the convention, and how these twin pillars of women's empowerment have helped to transform the law in India. And then you talked also about the Visakha case, which is also a paradigmatic case where Bandari Devi, who was a social worker, was sexually harassed and raped while she was working on issues of child marriage. And because there was no law on sexual harassment, the Indian Supreme Court then used the CEDAW to fill in those gaps. So CEDAW is such an important tool of translation and vernacularization. So I know it's very late in India, so you have to leave us, but I also want to tell our young leaders from around the world that you served as a CEDAW committee member, that you were one of the CEDAW committee experts that helped to shape the jurisprudence of the CEDAW. So you not only worked on the translation, but you also worked on the norm creation. So on behalf of the young men and women who have joined us from around the world, from Kazakhstan to Afghanistan, we thank you for the service that you have rendered around the world for women's empowerment.
Thank you, Rangita. It's been a pleasure talking to you and all those who have joined this meeting. Thank you, and we'll meet again soon. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, Indira. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Dr. Duran, we are joined, Dr. Paloma Duran, we are joined by Dr. Fatima Qasim, who has joined us all the way from Lebanon. So we promised our young leaders that we would have a global conversation, right, Dr. Paloma Duran? This is really a global conversation, bringing together North and the South.
Yes, and I think, Rangita, that the other thing that also we mentioned many times is that part of the beauty of CEDAW is that the convention is used in the continental tradition, in the continental legal tradition, and in the Anglo-Saxon legal tradition, meaning that the same framework is really used in a completely different approaches, where in one case is the code, and in the other cases is the jurisprudence and the decisions by the court. So I think that it's important that we keep this in mind, especially with the wonderful panelists that we have today. And also to keep in mind that this year is the anniversary of the entry into force of the convention. Because of course the convention was approved in 1979, but it was in 81st, if I remember correctly, the year of the entry into force. So really I wanted also to use the chance to say thank you. I think that Indira already left, but we have already Fatima with us that also can explain a lot about the impact of CEDAW in the national legislations. But over to you, Rangita.
So Dr. Fatima, thank you for joining us all the way from Lebanon. Your work as the first director, founding director of ESQUA was to examine the ways in which the CEDAW can be used in the Middle East in order to make those changes in the laws and to enhance the leadership of women in the Middle East. So my question to you is that how effective has the CEDAW been in that charge? And just recently, during the pandemic, Lebanon made a series of changes in the laws. Some of the changes that Indira was talking about equal rights on guardianship. And the Lebanese law that was changed provided a woman who was divorcing the right to guardianship of her children, that she would not lose her rights to guardianship on divorce. So that was a major change. Lebanon also introduced a law on sexual harassment, which again was an important revision of the law, similar to what we were talking of in India. So both these countries have undergone changes despite challenges, using the CEDAW as an important, what I would say, guiding principles, as normative principles, and as spearheading these changes. So Fatima, can you join us to tell us a little bit about the ways in which the convention's values, core values, have helped to make changes in Lebanon and in other countries in the Middle East?
Fatima, I think that you are mute. We cannot hear you.
Thank you for reminding me. Yeah, I was just thanking Rangita for inviting me to speak on this subject that is close to my heart. I just wanted to correct her on one thing. I'm not the founding director of ESQA. It has an executive secretary. I'm the founding director of the and the former director of the Center for Women within ESQA. So just to put things straight in UN language, lingo. I'll answer all your questions, Rangita, but I'm used to putting this within the context of the region that I served for a long time. And I like to look at the picture, at the cup as half full and half empty in the region. Half full because out of 22 countries in the League of Arab States and the Arab states, 20 countries are party by now to CEDAW. We have only Sudan and Somalia. Somalia is a failed state, so in reality, it's Sudan.
And Iran.
Now, as far as ESQA is concerned, Iran is not part of the ESQA regional grouping. You know, the UN has 5 regional groupings. Okay, so Iran belongs to the Asia Pacific grouping, regional commission. So, but having said that, I move to the cup that is half empty, the glass that is half empty. They have signed for the CEDAW 20 countries, but with very, very many reservations. And this is what keeps it from being a very effective tool in the region. And it is as if it's for international consumption, if you will, for cosmetic reasons. We are party to CEDAW. I worked with those countries and introduced the CEDAW to them. They signed, okay? They are party, but with many reservations, and reservations which I'm going to say something that is not done online. It's like unconsummated marriage. I mean, you cannot be party to CEDAW and then have 5 or 6 reservations, which one of them is the Sharia. Okay, as long as
it's the Article 16 on family.
There are 5 articles. Yes. There are 5 articles that the countries of the region have reservations on. Article 2, which is the national legislation, and they say if it does not, CEDAW will be implemented if it doesn't conflict with the national constitution, which means that they do not recognize that CEDAW as an international instrument has supremacy over national laws, and they should factor the national laws to fit CEDAW since they are signatories. Article 9 is on citizenship and nationality. Many countries, except for a handful of them, which they have removed the reservations, like the North African countries, Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, you have Palestine, you have Jordan, you have Egypt. Those have withdrew the reservations on nationality. Lebanon, for example, we still cannot pass on our nationality, Lebanese nationality, to our husbands and children from a foreign country. Article 15 is when you talk about equality in political and civil rights. Article 16, which is the most important, plus the nationality law, is the family law. And if you go back to what Indira was saying, they have, you know, the law that for Muslims, for Christians, for Jews, for Hindus, it's different. We have 18 confessions in Lebanon, and we have 18 laws. And the civil society has been pushing for a unified law. And you mentioned the guardianship. It is a blessing that now, but this depends, the Shia, the sect in Islam, they do not, when they divorce, the boy, if he's 2 years old, goes to his father. And this was it's not the thing that broke the back of women, and they kept in a violent marriage for their kids. Now they are allowed to keep their kids after divorce until they are 13, and then they are given the choice. And the last article where the regional countries have reservations is Article 29, which is the dispute settlements, and it mainly concerns relations with Israel. Okay, now you asked another.
I'm just going to ask you to pause now so we can have a conversation with Paloma also. So Paloma, because we went straight into the translation of the CEDAW, and I want to thank Dr. Fatima for taking us through some of these important articles. And you mentioned that countries have made reservations to Article 2, which is the very heart of the convention. It talks about the definition of equality. And I think, and I want to ask for just 2 minutes to talk about the most important CEDAW values. The first, that the convention was the first international treaty that looked at international law from a very different point of view. It allowed both, it covered both discriminatory acts in public life as well as in private life, and thereby dismantled that artificial barrier between the public and the private. And what the CEDAW did was open out the domestic sphere, the intimate sphere, and violence against women in the domestic sphere to international scrutiny. And thereby, what the CEDAW said in Article 2 was that it covers discriminatory acts, both by the public and the private sphere, by any person, organization, or enterprise. And that term person was revolutionary because it would mean that a domestic partner could be held culpable under international human rights law. That international human rights law was hitherto seen, as both of you know, Paloma and Fatima, as something that was interstate dispute resolution. It governed interstate relations. But the CEDAW for the first time made a private person central and was an actor in international law. So thereby what it did was to say that there was no distinction between the public and the private, that what is private is political, that private acts of violence, domestic acts of violence should be governed under international law. And then both you and Indira spoke about the importance of addressing cultural practices, cultural norms, and traditional practices. And that is also a revolution in the CEDAW. Article 5 of the CEDAW covers acts of cultural traditions and cultural practices, such as child marriage, dishonor killings, or what is known more commonly as honor killings, female genital mutilation, dowry, the Devaki and the Devi practices in India and Nepal. So all of these cultural practices that discriminate against women and devalue women are covered by the CEDAW. So I want to
And then
now
also,
turn to Paloma. Can you speak a little bit about the optional protocol of the CEDAW, Paloma?
Yeah.
The two optional
Yeah.
protocols are also important. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, we can, not for sure. And I was part of the process of the negotiation, so more than happy to talk about the optional protocol. But I think that one thing also, Rangita, that is important is that I think that this idea of the public and private sphere is important, because at some point the message is beyond the difference between private and public, because the message is violence against women, which is against a human being, is a social problem. It's not a problem for the family, it's a social problem, and it means that it requires a social response. And I think that this is really very, very significant. And also there is another question, Rangita, before to go to the protocol, if you allow me, which is just to put together Article 2 and Article 1, because I think that it's also important to recognize that for the first time we have an international definition about discrimination, which, I mean, of course, each country has a completely different legislation and can read Article 1 in different ways. But I think that Article 1 contains 3 words that are very, very important, which is distinction, exclusion, or restriction against women. So I think that, you know, even if in many cases countries can say, well, we have a specific legislation and we can read that according with the domestic legislation, I think that it's important to keep in mind, legally speaking, that we have these 3 references as the clear definition for discrimination. So I don't know, Fatima, you also agree with that, and Rangita, but I think that it's also important before to go to the protocol, just to go there.
Absolutely.
No?
Exactly.
So, and I think that with the protocols, I mean, maybe Rangita and Fatima probably are more I mean, experts on that, but I mean, the information about the protocol, it was just to be part of the delegation negotiating the protocol. And I think that it is also very significant, I mean, not only for the convention, for CEDAW, but for the whole international law. Because I think that the communication procedure is really a very unique legal tool to ensure that, I mean, normally I remember when I was working in the UN that in many occasions when the countries submitted the reports to the committee about the implementation of the convention, of course, normally they say very positive things, sometimes some challenges, but I think that it's important also to give the chance that individual or a group of individuals, that I remember that it was very tough to negotiate these words, individual or the group of individuals will be able really to submit a communication. It has a lot of legal implications. I don't want,
absolutely.
I don't know, Rangita, if you want that we open this door,
yeah,
but
no, absolutely. And that is why the CEDAW committee's general recommendations and concluding observations are important accountability measures, but they're not binding in the way that other international processes are, but they are a carrot and stick measure. And the reporting mechanism is binding, that all state parties to the convention need to, at regular intervals, every 4 years under the CEDAW, submit reports to the CEDAW committee. So that is binding. The fact that each country has to go through this auditing process, yes, and enter into a constructive dialogue with the CEDAW committee is binding. Now, as to the concluding observations, you're absolutely right. There is much debate as to whether that jurisprudence, how binding is that? And that is why we need groups such as Fatima and Indira and the 151 young participants around the world to hold their countries accountable to the concluding observations. So the first tool is, as soon as the concluding observations are released, to read, understand, underline, and hold their country responsible to that. So that was an excellent point, Paloma. I'm now going to go back to Fatima. So Fatima, one of the other important provisions, Paloma, as you know, in the CEDAW is what is called temporary special measures, right? Which is for the first time an introduction to substantive equality. So we moved, there's a shift from the liberal jurisprudence on formal equality, the way the United States looks at equality, to substantive equality as a way to address the legacy of discrimination against women. These are not handouts, these are not charitable, but this is a way to equalize the playing field and to address the legacy of discrimination, and it's temporary. So it's different. It's more nuanced than affirmative action. So you envision a point in time when you no longer need those measures, where women are equal. So it's temporary special. So it's a very nuanced understanding. So Fatima, can you talk to us a little bit about how those temporary special measures have been adopted? Many countries, especially post-conflict countries, have adopted quotas for women in parliament. And that is why we saw yesterday we spoke about this, Paloma, how from 11% 25 years ago, we have now risen to 25%. And that's mostly the countries that have adopted quotas.
Exactly.
So debatable as this is, it is an important tool. So Fatima, back to you on both the temporary special measures and the quotas and women in parliament in the Middle East.
Let me talk about this from the Lebanese perspective. You mentioned that the share of women in parliaments has risen. And in many countries, including in this region, in the ESCWA region, many countries adopted quotas. And this has improved the representation of women. But I want to caution the participants that even though, for example, in some countries they have 25%, in certain countries they started filling in their buddies, their sisters, their brothers, their party members, as long as they are women, and they are there like figureheads in the parliament. You don't want women to sit in parliament and be just a figurehead. It is a quality rather than quantity that we want. In Lebanon, we have, and you know, the anti-feminists in our patriarchal societies say that this, you are claiming you want equality and now you want a quota. You see, and to them, quota is not, unless we demand 50%. In Lebanon, we have been fighting for a quota, the civil society, for a long, long time. And the president of the republic said, you are entitled to a quota, but you have to prove yourself. Women have to prove themselves all the time to be 100%, but you see in parliament men who are not worth their seats. And let me tell you, we have not been able to get a quota in parliament. And in Lebanon, there are many problems in Lebanon. The implementation of CEDAW, if you go in the streets, not only in Lebanon, in many countries, they don't know about CEDAW. So there is a problem of dissemination, of raising awareness that there is this convention that you have a right to know. But if you don't know your rights, you can't, you can't implement them, and you can't ask for them. What about the factors limiting implementation at the regional level? Not only the question of the quota, but you have many factors that prevent, that limit the implementation of CEDAW, even though many countries give a rosy picture, report every 4 years to the committee, but this is coming from an official body. If you have the shadow reports, then you will get the real picture. And nothing is binding. Nothing in the UN is binding. I mean, everything. The committee, the CEDAW committee, is the closest you have to a binding. And then you have the Islamic Sharia, which they claim that women cannot become leaders. So you won't have many women running for a parliament or for government or assuming public positions. And then you don't have a political will. Our authoritarian governments do not care to have women in the public space. You need political will to enact laws, to translate CEDAW into national laws. Nobody is doing it. Nobody is doing it. And then you have political instability in the region. What do you expect? They will tell you women's equality and status is the least of our worries. We have economic problems, we have social problems, we have poverty, and you are telling us implement CEDAW. So they don't listen. Nobody listens. I don't know if
Fatima,
I answered your query.
Yes, Paloma?
Yeah, you know, one of the things that I was thinking now that you mentioned, there is no political will. And I think that the situation, especially after COVID, I previously was working also in the OECD. One of the last papers that I saw there that we prepared in the team confirmed that today, 56% of the global population are living in authoritarianism systems, let's say, which is really scary. So my point there is that I know that because cultural issues, because historical and religious and ethical traditions, there are some countries that really don't accept to have women as leaders, at least for the time being. So my point is, and of course, in many cases, they don't accept the quotas. I mean, we can organize another seminar about the quotas, because I think that in some cases, quotas are working and in some cases are not. But my point here is, how can we really contribute to change the cultural setting, or if you like, the political setting, in order to ensure the implementation of the CEDAW according with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the template for the CEDAW. Because what I see, especially during the last years, is that every time that we talk about CEDAW, sometimes we, or at least people that are working from my generation, working on that, are fighting, trying to push for quotas and push for leadership, for political leadership, which of course I'm the first one signing for that. But my point is that if this way really doesn't work, or at least, I mean, it doesn't have the impact that we want for the society, because we are not complaining in favor of women, we are promoting a better society, which will be with women and men at the equal level. So the point is, how can we really move this political and cultural setting in order to promote the legal changes?
So I think this is an excellent question. How do we create social change, and how do we create social change through the lenses of legal and cultural change, right? Because you need both the cultural change and the legal change. Now, Paloma, you and I are both lawyers, and we understand that although legal change alone is not going to create social change, it is normative and constitutive. It is the first step. And the process of creating a law, a new law, can create social and cultural change.
Definitely.
And you know, Fatima, a law reform takes 10 years. It takes an entire generation to move the law. And that 10 years results in very small baby steps towards reform. And the reform has to be measured through different indicators, and not just through law reform, but in numbers of women elected to local government, numbers of women that have risen in business, numbers of women who now have custody over their children, numbers of women who now own land. So there are these different metrics that need to be used to measure those small changes over the course of the 10 years. But change, as you know, is frustratingly slow. So just yesterday, the World Bank launched its 7th annual report on women, business, and the law. And unfortunately, in 2021, still 104 countries around the world have laws preventing women from carrying out certain jobs. So certain jobs are disallowed for women. So the law itself is complicit in women's subordination and women's devaluation. In 18 countries, men can legally prevent their wives from working. In 18 countries, you need to ask your husband permission to work. So as you know, the law itself discriminates. So that is why it is important for the CEDAW to use the CEDAW to take down those barriers. And it is done through what Indira was talking about, through litigation, which she did, representing these women in court. It is done through legal reform. And in all of the laws that I have studied, many of the laws, including the Philippines domestic violence law, the South African domestic violence law, the Brazilian Maria da Penha domestic violence law, all invoke the CEDAW in its preamble. So it becomes a part of the primacy of the CEDAW, as Fatima was talking about, the primacy of human rights, that these laws need to be interpreted in alignment with international women's human rights. Of course, even as you said, Paloma, even when the law changes, it's still not enough that, you know, people don't know their rights, people don't know the law. So Fatima and Paloma, I would like the two of you to engage in a conversation, Paloma, on what the OECD does in terms of, you know, you are part of GenderNet, in terms of creating this new movements around the world.
If I may say, you put in a very interesting point, Rangita. How can we, and I always think regionally, at the regional level. First of all, we can use the Moroccan Mudawwana case. The Mudawwana case, the Moroccan, they did a beautiful job by trying to marry the law with the Sharia and to interpret it in a women-friendly way, in such a way that it favored women. That's, many countries should emulate this in the region. And this is one of the most important things, because in our region, what happens is that there's a melange, a mix between religion and politics, and you don't know which one is which, but it is political Islam that takes place. And we keep on forgetting that women in the region are not one. There are different women in this region, and they're not only Muslims, we have Christians in the region too. So Muslims are not the only ones, but we need to take special measures. And I think CEDAW is not known. It might be known in OECD countries, but in this region, if we take a survey, very few people know what is CEDAW. So, and not only that, when the governments adopt it, and they are serious and they have the political will, they do not put a mechanism for implementation. They should have a mechanism to implement it. And none of the countries in the region have that mechanism. They do not even allocate funds to implement the CEDAW convention. Not only that, but even if they translate it into law, there's always a gap between the de facto and the de jure law. Absolutely. The law is put and they don't know. Now we're talking about the sexual harassment, the recent one in December 2020, the one in Lebanon. you never know how they will implement it. They will tell you we have a more important war to fight, the pandemic. And now you're telling us about CEDAW and how it is implemented. It is very important to bear this in mind and to keep on bringing the CEDAW into the picture, using the media, using social media. The women, even in the rural areas, should know about
and
it.
that is what UNITAR is doing by convening this
Yes.
important forum at the
Yes.
cusp of the Commission on the Status of Women. That is exactly what UNITAR is doing, building awareness and building a movement among young global leaders, because this is important to hand over the torch to them. Sharing the torch with them so they are aware of how to use the CEDAW, the tools of the CEDAW. We talked about the CEDAW values. These are revolutionary values. As Paloma and I discussed, that kind of breaking down the barriers between the public and the private was it revolutionized international law. The temporary special measures revolutionizes the way in which we think of women in leadership. So these are tools for our young leaders to use in their countries. So both of you brought any...
sorry. No, the only thing that I wanted just to say, just related to violence, is that, I mean, we don't have the final information about the impact of COVID on violence against women or gender-based violence. But, you know, I mean, during 2020, apparently, it increased by 30%.
Yes.
Violence against women, which is, I mean, is something really scary, because we are talking about a pandemic that I don't think that is going to be fixed the day after tomorrow, unfortunately, even if, of course, with the medical treatment and the medical research, at least in some countries, apparently people are getting better. But I think that still we have pandemia for a long time. And the impact are for women, not only because violence, but because also 62% of the people, of the workers in the health sector are women and girls. So, I mean, they are in the front line of the pandemic too. So what I'm trying, that's the reason, because always I think, and I discussed with Rangita many times about that, I mean, that of course law is a very important thing, but there are many countries where I think that they are very far away of the law. So from my point of view, and I'm sorry if this is something sensitive for anybody, I fully respect all the positions about that, but sometimes I read the situation of women as the process of slavery. It took 2 centuries to change everything, 2 centuries.
So when Fatima and you both asked the question, when laws don't work, what are the other arguments we can bring forward? So the first and foremost, the primacy is the human rights argument. But then there's the macroeconomics argument. What you talked about, Paloma, about the rise of violence against women, the escalation of violence against women during COVID. And we know that violence against women is costly. It's a macroeconomic issue. So we know that even before the pandemic, that the global cost of violence against women had been estimated at approximately $1.5 trillion. So these are avoidable costs, right? These macroeconomic costs bring our GDP down across the world. This is before COVID. And what they say is that these are underreported costs. These costs are much larger because these are only the reported costs. And we know that around the world that violence against women, especially domestic violence, results in more lives lost than all conflicts put together. So here we are putting all our money into wars, right? And national security, when the war at home needs a ceasefire, as the Secretary General said. And money has to be put in for that ceasefire because more lives are lost, more lives are destroyed because of domestic violence than during war.
Yeah, if I may have the floor, we're talking about violence against women, domestic violence in the streets, but now what's on the rise is violence online, abuse, disinformation, fake news, which deters women from going into politics. They take a political figure or a journalist and they tarnish their images online, and there's a new field going on in that direction, and women are lobbying against this because the companies, Twitter, Facebook, you name it, all those, the WhatsApp, all those social media, they are not concerned about women, and the authoritarian governments are not concerned about women's safe spaces, and they don't care
But they're
less.
not concerned about the women. But Paloma, as you know, Paloma, having worked at OECD, governments are concerned about the costs. Economic costs tell a story, even when the human story doesn't move governments. So if we can, unfortunately, I hate to do this as a human rights scholar, but if we can monetize it also and say, this is the cost of sexual harassment, the costs of child marriage, the costs of women's lack of participation in the economy, that then makes a case for change in laws and attitudes.
Of course.
But you know, Rangita, unfortunately, I fully agree with you that really the economic side is an important one, but there are many countries where it doesn't matter.
No.
I mean, the economic cost, it doesn't matter. I mean, I'm sorry if I'm very candid, but I think that, I mean, in some cases, as I mentioned before, I think that we need to see how to really to distribute, as already Fatima mentioned, I mean, to distribute more information about CEDAW, more work also with the lawyers, more work with the politicians, more work with people that are trying to work in the civil society side, trying to push for that. I think that, you know, there are many venues maybe to influence really the mindset of the society, and it's not easy, but my concern is that after 26 years, after Beijing, of course, we improve in some areas, but we are still very far away of gender equality.
Absolutely.
So, I mean,
so what I want to do is in the remaining 30 minutes, look at how the CEDAW can be used in building back better in this global reset and global recovery. So the three major areas, Paloma, we have been looking at since yesterday was violence against women, women and education, and women in leadership. And in all three areas, CEDAW can play a role. Article 10 is on girls' education and addressing stereotypes in girls' education, the way in which girls are not educated at the same level as boys. And that is one of the root causes of child marriage, because girls are kept at home and not kept. So how can we raise the mandatory age for school education? I think these are issues that need to be considered in building back better. How can we, as the World Bank reports, there are still 45 economies that don't have laws on violence against women in the home. So how can we change those laws in building back better? And then women in decision-making and women in leadership. As we spoke yesterday, the countries that are run and led by women are doing better during this era.
Yeah, you know, Rangita, what I'm thinking is that, I mean, we already have the Honorable Mushira Kataf with us, that I think that she has a lot of experience on political leadership. So maybe you can introduce her.
That Mushira had joined us. Mushira, welcome, Mushira. So Mushira Kataf was the first woman minister for family and population in Egypt. She was also the vice chair of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. She held many ambassadorial posts in Egypt. And just recently, she was Egypt's nominee to head UNESCO. So she brings with her a wealth of expertise, both in the region, in Egypt, and in the world, to speak to us about these important issues. So Mushira, we've been talking about how do we use the convention as an important tool in building back better. And we've been talking about how the convention is an important tool in law reform, in organizing, in human rights reporting, and in accelerating the power of women in decision making and amplifying women's voices. So Mushira, can you share with us some words of wisdom?
Thank you so much. And I have a feeling I'm a bit late. I think our time was 8 o'clock.
I think we are having problems with the times. No, it was 7 o'clock, but that's fine. You're here with us. You're here with us, Mushira. I sent you an email. That's completely fine. Yeah.
Because I marked
Lovely
it
to
as
welcome you. And we have young leaders from around the world sharing the stage with us.
all right. Well, thank you very much for having me. And it's a great honor to be with these great leaders. CEDAW has been signed decades ago, yet up to this moment, it is not popular. And we should not be deceived by speeches given at international fora. What really matters is the narrative at home. The translation of the political will is what transpires at home, at the national level. So domestication of CEDAW is critical. Translating CEDAW into legislation, and not only into legislation, but making sure that the legislations are applied, because you can have legislation and some judges tell you, sorry, I don't know about this law on violence against women. So when we domesticate the CEDAW, we have to domesticate it within the strong legislation, such as the penal code, the civil status code. But if you have a law on the family, that's not enough. Many judges will not look at the law on the family, and they will pretend they don't know it. So it is and that's why when I put the clause banning child marriage, I put it in the personal status law, and it's still going. When I want
to get back to that. I want to get back to that because I think you made a very important point that we've been talking about for the last 1 hour, the domestication process, what I call the vernacularizing, the CEDAW international action. And when you said that the CEDAW is not enough, and we've been talking that CEDAW alone is not enough, I want to talk as our next phase, the importance of intersections, connecting the CEDAW to other human rights instruments like the CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And you did that in Egypt. You used the CEDAW and the CRC because you were the vice chair of the CRC committee, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and you brought them together to challenge female genital mutilation. And you did that in revising the children's law. So you kind of like by stealth, it was a stealth operation. Exactly. By using the values of the CEDAW and the empowerment of women and girls, and you brought it through the child rights law because you knew that that was something that the lawmakers wouldn't refuse to pass. It was less controversial. Exactly. So we had to be strategic in the ways in which we ensure that the political will is given to you, right?
Exactly. And currently, I am the first vice chair of the African Committee on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. And we are doing the same exercise, model laws. How? Because it's not enough to have a law. It's not enough. It's what kind of law? And what do you do after you have the law? And I take this from Rangita. When I presented the amended child's law in New York, I remember Rangita said, now that the law has been adopted, what's next? And she opened my eyes to raising awareness of the law, building the capacity of law enforcement, be it the judiciary, the police, the social workers, everyone working on implementing the law, allocating resources for applying the law. This is very important. Monitoring the implementation of the law, because maybe you have court verdicts that never see the daylight. They are not implemented. In the case of female genital mutilation, we were so happy that the law is applied and the doctor who operated was taken to court and his clinic was closed. But then 2 or 3 months later, the father make peace with the doctor, and the father is the one who reported when his daughter died. But then he made out of the court settlement, subject closed. He received compensation from the doctor or what have you, and subject closed. So the court verdict is not implemented. So now we insist to see the result of the court case, what happens. And these are the details that not many people stop at. We have to be very careful because we put a lot of effort in formulating. It took me 5 years, and I had many fights with the Minister of Justice, with the parliamentarians, the Speaker of the Parliament. He added 1 word in the article about criminalization of female genital mutilation that killed my article. I am glad this has been reversed, and now the penalty is even harsher. There is more awareness of the law, but it is a long way. It is a long way, and we have to focus at the national level. At the United Nations, all leaders say great words, but when they go home, it's a different story. They have to be held accountable. And national councils of women or ministries of women must be empowered by strong mandate, human and financial resources. Otherwise, domestication of CEDAW will be just a piece of paper. And we have to know that now, if I can talk about our region, the MENA region, it's not a homogeneous region. We have countries that have achieved a lot and countries that are not achieving. And we have some countries that achieved at the public sphere, but the situation in the private sphere is humiliating. And this is really what we have to look at. And you know, violence against women at home. The Security Council agenda on women, peace and security, it's just one resolution after the other, expressing dismay with the lack of progress. But what do we do to implement? COVID-19 and the rise of violence against women. What has the Security Council done? Has anybody how do you say it, invoked the resolution 1325?
Right. And we are going to be talking, we are focusing on women, peace and security tomorrow as a separate area. But as you know, all these issues are so inextricably interlinked. Mm-hmm. So what I would like to do is, in the remaining 15 minutes, see what questions we can answer from our global leaders. Pelayo and Ali, could you try to distill some of these questions?
You know, while Rangita, they are trying to do so, what I would like also to ask to Fatima, taking into account also the experience in the whole region, did you see during the last 25 years since Beijing some kind of improvement? Because I mean, I know that each region is completely different. Of course, each country is completely different. The law is very different. But can you say that is there any kind of movement there, or I mean, how is your approach? Is it pessimistic, optimistic, in the middle?
I'll tell you what. We have to be optimistic. I mean, we've gone way ahead in 25 years, since 1995, especially that the CEDAW remains the framework for implementing the Beijing Platform for Action. On the education level, women have improved. We still have loopholes. We still have illiteracy in Yemen, high illiteracy in Morocco, high illiteracy in Yemen. And as I mentioned earlier, women are not the same all over the region, but they have the same problems. The intensities are different. On the level, because of the availability of money, of funding, and because we were able to, I think the health has improved, the mortality rate has improved. I don't have the statistics on hand, but they are available on the ESQA web page. So the mortality rate, the child mortality rate has improved. On both these two scores, we can say there's a great improvement. Even at the of economic participation. At the private sector, the rate of CEOs, the share of CEOs has risen, but the overall regional picture for employment in the labor market does not exceed 25 to 30%. It's still one of the lowest among the regions.
So there's one question. Yeah.
Let me continue with political part.
15 minutes more. I'm going to ask each of you, and I will also respond to one question which I think conceptualizes our conversation, which is what are the good practices of the implementation of CEDAW domestically? I think that's a good question, which will help us to look at the kind of panoramic sweep of all of this. So I'm going to start with Mushira. She was the last guest to arrive. What are the good practices? And we've already talked about, your own leadership in the female genital mutilation law, which is one good practice of domesticating the CEDAW, and the ways in which you brought together men and women in that fight. So can you speak about another way in which the CEDAW has been domesticated as a good practice? And we will go around the room with that, sharing stories.
Very important is to bring religious leaders on board and the media on board, because these are two educators that are free. I mean, with the religious leaders, it's an endless interpretation that they give you to abort any attempt of reform. So bringing them on board, educating them in a very diplomatic way is very important. And now, if you are following, there is a big row in Europe against Muslims, and this is very serious. And in the pipeline, a very important and great initiative that I am working on that can make a paradigm shift, because our part of the world is very religious, be it Muslim, Christians, Jews, very religious. So a word by a religious man it's like the Bible. Nobody can say anything. So bringing religious leaders, and like we said, the cost. When I joined you, I heard you talking about the cost, the economic cost of violence against women. How much it costs for a woman not to go to work, to miss work days. how much it costs for a woman to change her way to work to avoid harassment, how much of a cost to the economy, not to the woman, to have an escort because she's afraid to go alone, and endless. The cost of not educating a young girl, it's a humongous cost for the family. So now,
and for the GDP, it's a huge cost for the GDP of the country.
For
So
Egypt,
these were excellent words of wisdom, especially about the ways in which you worked with religious leaders, for them to see that FGM has got nothing to do with Islam, it predated Islam. So how can we work with the leaders? Because as we know, as we speak, fundamentalism is sweeping across the world. So I'm going to now turn to Paloma. Can you give us an example of the domestication of CEDAW as a good practice?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I think that if we look to the European side, I think that there are some good examples in the implementation, for instance, of Article 4 related to temporary special measures, even if, of course, we have in Europe both traditions, the continental and the Anglo-Saxon. But I think that it was good in the sense that, in fact, the Council of Europe decided after the entry into force of the CEDAW, the Council of Europe decided to prepare a kind of a specific report taking into account all the legislations and trying to see how to integrate these special measures in education, in the political sphere, in the civil law, in the labor market. So, I mean, the idea was just to collect different lessons learned, taking into account that, of course, each legislation is different. So I think that it was good. It was a report that I was very lucky because I was part of the group that prepared the report, and the report was approved by the General Assembly in the Council of Europe, which I think that is positive in the sense that today all the countries that are members of the Council of Europe, not the European Union, beyond that, in the Council of Europe, they can use this report as a reference with specific examples. I'm not saying that all of them are going to be useful in every country, but for instance, in the case of the labor market, it was really very positive because it was the entry point to introduce some reforms related to parental rights or maternity rights, taking into account that maternity is just a fact. I mean, it's not a special measure, but I mean, it's a specific time for the women, but also for the father. So, I mean, it was a very interesting, I don't have now the time to go to the details, but it was very interesting because in many countries in the Council of Europe, they changed the law because of that.
So because I want Fatima to have the last words, I'm going to go next. And I'm going to speak very briefly about an issue that concerns the young people who have joined us. In the last couple of years, period shaming and menstruation has become a huge issue for our young people. And you're very active in this. But I want you to remind you of a time when in my part of the world, in South Asia, in Nepal, where girls and women who were menstruating were considered unclean. They were not considered pure. So they had to sleep in the outhouses in their homes, out in the jungles, out in the fields, in a small house. So there were period huts for these young women and girls to sleep in, which was very dangerous for them. But they were forced because they were not considered clean. And the women, the lawyers in Nepal, led by Sapana Malla, used the CEDAW, the Article 2 of the CEDAW, the anti-discrimination provision, as well as Article 5, which challenges and addresses customary practices that subordinate women. So together, Article 2 of the CEDAW and Article 5 of the CEDAW were brought together to challenge this cultural practice that forced girls and women who were menstruating and lactating to sleep outside their homes. So I thought this is an example for our leaders from around the world, because this is an issue that you're now fighting for. You're fighting for sanitary napkins. You're fighting for taking away the shame that that is associated with periods, to normalize periods as part of the human condition. So I want you to understand the journey of this and how women around the world have fought to live in dignity when they are menstruating and lactating.
Can I give a quick example, please, in a minute? I am a member of the advisory committee of a program called Inactus. It's for university students to make projects, and this program is global, international, and it's supported by the private sector internationally, big corporations. We have encouraged students, male primarily, to choose programs on manufacturing sanitary napkins at very, very fraction of the price, from the banana trees, from things like that. So you raise awareness of the rights of the girl not to stop going to school because of this, or not to stop going, and not to be ashamed that she's having her period. And this program has gotten the World Cup. They got the World Cup for making this. And for the second year in a row, we have another team from another university. First, it was the UK, then it was Egypt, and it was the University of Azhar, El Azhar, the highest religious. And I wrote an article congratulating Sheikh El Azhar, because this project raised awareness of the rights of the girl and removed the shame that Rangita was talking about. I just thought to share this with you.
Fatima?
Yeah, I have a recommendation really to end the session. We're talking about the good practices in the Council for Europe. And I was thinking that we always say we should emulate good practices. Maybe one recommendation could come out from this panel is to organize something around those lines, how to emulate good practices and what is possible in our region or across the regions for the implementation of CEDAW. And then you asked what is the good cases in the region. I think the best cases that we can emulate in the region are the Maghreb Mudawana, where they built alliances with religious leaders, as I mentioned earlier, and to come to women-friendly interpretations of the Quran or the Sharia. And Tunisia is a good example. So we could, they have really implemented CEDAW in a very good way, and they have removed almost all, withdrew almost all reservations on CEDAW. But maybe by exchanging and emulating good practices, we can come out with a good lesson and try to implement it at the national level. Although I believe that we are a long, long way from gender equality in the countries of the region. It could be there are pockets, but the countries are far away, because we need to change the mindset. We need to have political stability to start with. We need to have a culture of peace and a culture of democracy and a political will. I close with the political will because I believe that political will makes or breaks this. We have the CEDAW, we have the Beijing Platform for Action, and we have the SDGs. But where did this put us? I was answering you saying that at the level of political leadership, we are zilch, we are nowhere.
But I think, Fatima, yes, for sure, I'm going to give you the floor. Yes, only to say that I think that is the political will and resources really to change many things. You are completely right. But please go ahead, Mushira.
Paloma, the OECD has
Yes.
conducted a process with the region, Kautar, the NGO, and they produced a report, and I am honored to have been one of the reviewers of this report about economic empowerment and political participation of women in 4 countries, Jordan, Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt.
Very happy to hear that, because I was part of the authors of the report. So very happy to hear that.
Excellent report. And it really went 2 or 3 steps at the bottom, at the root causes, like why women are not employed in competitive private market, private sector, because mostly women are employed by the public sector. And it's a very interesting report. I advise you to read it, please.
Okay, thank you so much. I didn't say any kind of propaganda, especially because I just left the OECD 3 weeks ago. So, but anyway.
Not only
but you still feel you belong there.
By which it was made. The process is excellent.
Yeah, no. Okay, so Rangita unfortunately left because she has a class to teach now, and we need to close, but I think that this is the confirmation that we need to continue with this conversation. It is important still to work on CEDAW and to try to see what are the needs and priorities for each region and for each country, but of course to insist in the idea to use a template of the CEDAW as a reference for the laws, but as Fatima mentioned and we discussed in the beginning, also to change the political setting and also the cultural setting, which is also an important thing. So I think that the questions will be probably for another session, because unfortunately we use all the time, but tomorrow we will continue discussing on women, peace and security, and the day after on the SDG 5. So you will be more than welcome to participate in both sessions. And I wanted also to say thank you to the panelists, that it was a very interesting conversation. Thank you so much to all the participants, and as usual also thank you to Pelayo and all the team in UNITAR for the work that they are doing, which is really very unique. So thanks to everybody, and see you tomorrow, I hope.
I have a point of clarification, please,
Yes.
Paloma, because
Yes.
I am currently involved in another Zoom conference from the 1st till the 5th, and I want to know if I should attend tomorrow, or I am invited to attend if I would like.
Completely up to you. We will be more than happy to have you here tomorrow, because I think that it's important to have you in the conversation. I mean, it's a completely open conversation. Tomorrow we will have, yeah, I mean, if you can, I mean, and Fatima, the same for you and for all the participants. I think that to listen experiences is a very positive thing.
Okay, because Rangita told me on the 2nd at 8 o'clock. That's why I only logged in at
I think that Rangita, poor thing, is in the middle of the semester with thousands of classes, and I think that she's trying to fix the agenda and doing her best.
What time is it? What time is it in Cairo?
Now it is 8:30. And
it's 8:30, but I think that
Lebanon.
Yeah, but you know, I think that Rangita calculated the time thinking in Europe, because here now is in, I'm now actually in Madrid, and it's 7:30. So I think that she, I mean, but anyway, she did her best, and I'm very grateful because we have this conversation.
It has been a great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Shukran, shukran, gazilan, shukran.
Shukran, bye-bye.
Shukran, bye.